Okay, I'm back. I fixed the space issue and I'm going to keep going from where I left off. So, I was telling you about how I moved back. My sister and I switched bedrooms, and there was this window between our rooms because the room that I was now in used to be a garage. It was a converted garage. So, this window had a panel on the top that had glass in it, and in the bottom, there was no panel. It was just open so we could like pass things back and forth between the two rooms. And it was also plenty big enough for you to climb through if you wanted to get to one room, from one room to the other. Um, that made it difficult for me when my father was breaking into the house to secure that room so that he couldn't get in there to steal things from me. So I ended up boarding up that window. I got a piece of wood, nailed it to the window, or maybe I didn't nail it. I don't think I did nail it. I think I just set it up there so that I wouldn't put holes in the house. But I had the window up, and then I had this big dresser in front of it. I think that's what kept it in place. Things got to the point where I went out and purchased a deadbolt, and I installed it myself on my bedroom door. So in my childhood home, in my bedroom, I had a deadbolt on my bedroom door to keep my father out, to keep him from stealing my things. The thing was, I took every precaution that I could think of, but drug addicts, if you have any in your life, are very manipulative and very crafty, and they find ways to get what they want. So he did things like coming through my sister's side of the window, and he was able to move the board and crawl through the window and even climb up and like between the dresser. I don't know if he moved the dresser to get through. I don't know what. But he was able to get in the room through the window, and I ended up stacking things on top of the dresser and putting things in very precise places so that I would know if things were moved when I got back home from school. And that didn't do a whole lot. It told me if he came in through that route, but there was still nothing I could do about it. He'd still deny anything he stole. And then it got to a point where I'd come home and I'd find things missing from my room that had this boarded up window and a deadbolt on the door. But the wood and all the things on my dresser top were still in exactly the same place. So he didn't come through the window. And I know I've got a deadbolt on the door, so how did he get in? And it turned out that the hinges on my bedroom door were on the outside of the door, and he took the pins out and took the door off the hinges to get into my room. So at that point, there was nothing I could do to prevent him from getting in my room. I still kept the wood and the door up to make it a little harder for him, but he went in whenever he wanted and took whatever he wanted. So the next step was to try to lock my things up within my room. I got those little like Sentry fireproof safes that you put small things in. Apparently the locks are pretty terrible on those. They may be fireproof, but they are not drug addict proof. And he was able to open them up with no problem and get anything he wanted out of them. So I upgraded to some big plastic storage trunks that had a big hinge on the back, and then you could put a lock on them, what are those locks? I forget the brand name of them, but just any kind of lock, you could put a lock on them. And I knew he didn't have the key or the combination, whatever kind of lock I had, but things would come up missing from this trunk. And it turned out he was pulling the giant pin out of the back of the hinge and opening it up from the back. So my father was kind of funny. Sometimes he would have these moments of honesty and transparency to a degree. And so one day I took him with me to Academy, which, if you're not familiar with that, is a sports equipment store, camping gear, things like that. And I had him help me pick out a gun safe that he would not be able to break into. And he actually did help me pick one out, and he was never able to get into it. So that was good. So I had a window boarded up in my room to keep him out that didn't work. I had a deadbolt on my bedroom door that didn't work. And now I have a gun safe in my bedroom just to lock up things like CDs and books and, little things that I didn't want coming up missing. So I had that for the rest of the time we were at the house, and that worked pretty well. Sometimes I neglected to put things in it, so I would still come home and find things missing. And then things like my computer and stuff wouldn't fit in there. And I don't think he ever took the computer. And the computer I had back then was one of those old desktops. It was one of the early-ish ones that you could buy at Best Buy, and it was an e-machine. Remember those? So we dealt with that every day. You would come home, undo the deadbolt, unlock the deadbolt on my room and check to see what was missing today and confront him about it, and he'd lie about it, and the whole spiel. Let's see. I'm going down my list here. So obviously, if you're living in a situation like that, and I was old enough to leave, but I wasn't financially stable at all. I was still in school. I was working part-time while I was going to college, and there was no way I could afford to move out and buy or pay rent or do anything like that. So it was very frustrating living in this environment. And as a kid, it's very frustrating. I tried doing things to him, but I was also a good kid who never wanted to get in trouble, so I was afraid to do too much. I remember two things that I did that were really outside of who I was. Two things that were vengeful, and I'm not a vengeful person, but this is how frustrated I got. So one was I took his wallet one day and just chucked it into the backyard. And he couldn't find it, and then he accused me of taking it, and I denied it, right? I was trying to do the same thing to him that he was doing to us. I was trying to take something from him. And eventually they figured out that I took it, and they made me go and find it in the yard and give it to him, or at least tell him that I threw it out there and he found it. I don't remember. The other thing I did was he had this giant television. You remember those big ones that sat on the floor that are in the wood cases? Those things are enormous and so heavy. And that TV belonged to his parents, who had both died around the time that he lost his job and all of this stuff started with the cocaine and stuff. Back when I was in 5th grade. So this TV, I wanted to do something to hurt him. I wanted to do something to get back at him. So I took a baseball bat. I don't know why we had a baseball bat, but I took this baseball bat and swung it as hard as I could into the screen of this television, thinking I was going to break it. And it was really funny because I hit this TV screen and it did not break. It did not chip, nothing. That thing was solid. And all that happened was the baseball bat, it was like a cartoon. It went boing. It was pretty funny, and it hurt my hands. So I learned my lesson there. Never try to bust a television, at least one of those old, real solid ones. Besides that, I took my frustration and anger about the situation out on my mother because I felt like she was the one that could get us out of it. And I won't go into why the situation lasted for as long as it did, which I think I mentioned was about 10 years. But I will tell you soon how it did end and how she got us out of it. But I remember a couple of times we went to family counselors at the church where we were at the time. And now I forget which one was the first or second, but one of them I went in alone. I think it was the first one. And I talked to this guy and I think maybe my dad had already been talking to him and then he wanted to see us each individually. But I went in and talked to this guy, and while I was telling him some of the things that were going on and how it was affecting us, I started tearing up a little. And I'm somebody who doesn't like to cry in front of people, and especially like strangers. So I was kind of trying to control that and tell the story rather than sit there crying. And this therapist said, "Oh, is she going to cry?" Like, it was really weird. I don't know what he was doing. It was terrible practice, but it made me even more self-conscious, and it was rude, and I never went back to see him. And then we saw a different therapist at the same church at some point in this time period. And we saw that person as a family just one time that I remember. And I remember him saying to me that I was taking on the parent role, that I was trying to, I don't know, I was trying to make decisions that the parents should be making. And I was like, well, yeah, somebody has to get us out of this situation. And yeah, so that was the therapy thing. I also went to the police a few times. There was, let me think. Okay, so there was one time we had a local police department in the neighborhood, and I went over there and I asked to speak to an officer, and they put me with a sergeant, and I told him what was going on. And they said there was nothing that they could do about it because, you know, unless they caught him in the act, they needed proof and all that. And I think they also might have verified that my mom couldn't legally kick him off the property, that he was allowed to be in the garage there. But what they did do was go to the computer and print out his pawn records. And I remember this was back in the days where printers had the papers that I think I was talking to my boyfriend about this last night, and he called it dot matrix paper. It's where it had like white and green lines, and on the edges there were these little holes, and you could tear the edges off, and then the paper was attached to each other in these big sheets, and it would fold like accordion style. So they printed out the pawn records, and this officer held, he was standing, and he held the papers up, and he like dropped the papers. He held onto the top ones and dropped the rest, and the thing fell to the floor. And even he was amazed at how much my father had pawned. Another time, my guitar came up missing. I had a neighbor who was a guitar player and a boyfriend at this time who was a guitar player. And so I took up guitar and never learned much of anything. But I had a guitar and it came up missing. So I'm sure I asked my father about it and he denied it. I went around to the local pawn shops that I knew he frequented looking for it. I found it at one of them. I told the owner of the pawn shop that it was stolen. It belonged to me, and I had my receipts to prove it. So one of us called the police, and an officer came and looked at the receipts that proved it was mine and all this stuff, and I told him the situation. And the officer said that it wasn't stolen because it was in my father's house and he had the right to take anything he wanted from our house legally. So that was pretty frustrating. I remember at one point the cops, and this isn't related to that, this was something else, but the cops showed up at our house one night and arrested him. That was all very... it wasn't like in the movies where they break down your door or anything. It was all very calm and respectful. They knocked on the door. I think it was 2 or 3 officers. It seemed like there were several cars. You know how anytime there's anything going on, all the police in the city show up, right? And same thing with like fire departments. You'll see 20 fire trucks. But anyway, they knocked on the door. They didn't come in the house, not as far as I remember anyway. And he said, okay, let me get my shoes on or whatever. And he went with them. And no big deal. I remember I have vague memories of visiting the city jail and seeing him in court, getting sentenced to go to prison. And these were for minor drug charges. It was possession of less than a gram of cocaine. And he's been in and out of jail and prison, I don't know how many times now, for that same charge. And I haven't spoken to him for, 5 years or so now. And when I am interested in seeing if he's dead or alive, one of the things that I do is check the public records for inmates to see, you can go and search for their names to see if somebody's an inmate or not, and it'll tell you whether they are in custody, where they are, and the charge, and maybe the sentence. I'm not sure. It's been a while since I looked at that. Going through my list here. So visiting prison was kind of fun because, you grow up and you see that sort of thing on TV, and you don't think that you're ever going to go visit a prison, right? Why would you have somebody in your life who is doing bad things? You wouldn't want somebody like that in your life. So I went to visit him in prison twice, and I went not to see him. I went to see prison and to experience what that was like, and just out of curiosity, So I remember the first time we went, it was me, my mom, I don't know if my sister went or not. The first time you go in, you have to wait in this line and get in, and you walk through the metal detector, and then they also wand you with the metal detector wands. And you have to turn in, things that they don't let you take into the prison, and show your ID and all this stuff. And then this first time they took us into this outdoor space. Well, there was a room that had tables, like a kitchen or a cafeteria kind of. But then we went out, there was this little outdoor space with picnic tables. And I remember you weren't allowed to touch the person. You had to sit across the table. But we were sitting there laughing about it, that we were at prison. And then the second time I went, it was a different visiting situation where you've seen this on TV and movies. They have the glass, and you have to pick up the phone and talk to the person. So that was interesting. He went into rehab a few times. I remember one time when he was at this prison, he got out early because they allowed him to go into rehab, and he was supposed to stay there. But for some reason, I guess the judge was trying to be nice, but it wasn't a good thing for us. The rehab center he sent my father to was in our neighborhood, and it was a place where it wasn't locked down. You could walk out and leave, but you weren't supposed to. And he stayed there for a little bit, I don't know, maybe a couple of weeks, and then left. And, so anytime he had an opportunity to better himself and, get off of the drugs and all that, he never took it or never took it seriously, or whatever the case may be. At this point, I want to tell you about the house we were living in, because while all this was going on, and we've got my mother with this one income, which was not a huge income, trying to take care of everything, all the normal expenses, and then in addition having to get our stuff out of the pawn shop constantly. There wasn't money for repairs for the house. So the house started falling into disrepair, and by the end of our time there, it was at the point where the people who bought it from us had to tear it down and rebuild it. So let me give you a description of the house. So it was an older home in a neighborhood in Houston. It was, I don't know exactly, but I would guess the house was built in the 40s or 50s, somewhere around there. It was a very basic kind of house. It was one story. It had, basic carpeting. I think the carpeting we got, I think when my mom maybe worked at some office and they were redoing carpeting there, somehow we got the carpeting that they were taking out and put that in our house. So it was like industrial carpeting. We never had new furniture. All the furniture we had was hand-me-down stuff. The house was cluttered. There was just stuff everywhere, and so that gives you a base idea before even all the drugs and everything. But it just got worse and worse. So in 2001, we had Tropical Storm Allison. Yeah, that's when it was. 2001, Tropical Storm Allison hit Houston. Houston was underwater. You can Google that and see pictures of it. Our house did not flood because on our street we were up on this little hill, maybe about 3 feet high, but the hill dipped down toward our house, so we did get some water into the front, and then we got some water in through the back door. And we realized, it seems like a few years later, that water had also come up under the house, and we didn't have a foundation on that house. I don't know why, but it wasn't built with a foundation, so it was just dirt, and then the wooden floorboards, and then the carpet. So by the time we left, there were places where you didn't even want to step on the floor because there was carpet, and then the wood under it was all rotted. So you would just kind of step down and be mushy when you'd walk on those spots. Because of the water that came into the back of the house and got into the sheetrock, and that was never replaced because there was never money to replace it, we had entire walls covered in green and black mold. I don't know how we never got sick from that because I heard that stuff is really toxic, but we had entire walls covered in mold. We also had leaks in the roof. Anytime it rained, there'd be little waterfalls throughout the house. So it got to the point where we just took pots and pans and set them out where the water would come in, and they'd catch in the pots and pans. And we just left those out all the time. There were probably, 5 or so pots and pans just sitting around the house. So if it rained, the water would go in there. We'd dump them out and fill them back up. The house was infested with roaches and rats. With the roaches, it was mostly little tiny ones, but there were the big ones too that you see. And that you couldn't leave food out at all. You couldn't leave any food in the kitchen cabinet. Like if you were making a sandwich, you couldn't put the bread down and then go to get the lunch meat out of the fridge, because by the time you turned around, there'd be roaches on your bread, like literally. In the oven, it was one of those that's not under the stove. It was built into the wall, like an old-fashioned from the 50s oven. And I remember it had this dial with like the temperature setting or something, or the timer maybe. And when you turn the oven on and it would heat up, you'd see roaches crawling through the dial. You would wake up sometimes because a giant roach was crawling across your foot, things like that. And I still have, I've always, as long as I can remember, since I was a little kid, I've been afraid of roaches, and this did not help. And I still have some major issues with them on the rare occasions that I see them these days. And yeah, I've gotten better about that, but yeah, I have problems with roaches. At some point, and I don't quite remember the timing of this, but there was a period of a few years when I didn't have a bed. And I don't remember why, because I always had a bed growing up. But anyway, I didn't have a bed at some point. It may have been after I came back from college and was staying and going to college in Houston. So I remember at some point later I got a futon, so that's probably when it was. So anyway, I slept on the couch in the living room. And at night, sometimes you could hear rats crawling under the couch. And at least they never crawled on you, but you could hear them around the house. I remember one night my sister and I stayed up, and So the kitchen in this house, the sort of layout was like you walk in the front door and there was an L-shaped living room. And then that led to the kitchen, which was a galley kitchen, which is where you just walk straight through, kind of like a hallway. And on one side, the kitchen was closed off, but on the other side, the kitchen was open to the den, which was a big room in the back of the house. So my sister and I stayed up one night, and we sat on the kitchen counter looking into the den. And we kept our dog food back there, just like big 40-pound bags of dog food. And we sat on the kitchen cabinets, looked out into the den, and watched as, I don't know, maybe a dozen rats or so came out as it got darker and later and went into the dog food and ate the dog food. So that was fun. At least we were able to have a sense of humor about some of it, because like my sister and I can look back on that and laugh about it. I think even then we laughed about it. And the prison thing, we were laughing about that then, and we still do. But yeah, it's not normal, but it was our normal. So what else here? Okay, so now I'm going to move on to how it finally ended. And spoiler alert, it ended because my sister pulled a knife on my father. So I couldn't remember exactly the story of this because I wasn't there. She and my dad were home alone. So I texted my sister the other day, I'm going to read this to you, and she did give me permission to read this to you. So I texted her, I said, I'm working on planning for the YouTube video about our father. I know you said you were fine with me doing it, but I still want to run some things by you. How do you feel about me mentioning that you drew a knife on him? How about that you were a really angry kid because of how we lived with him, but how you've turned your life around since getting away from him? And she wrote back, she said, that's fine. Just be sure to mention that I was defending myself from him, that I drew the knife only because he had physically abused me in the past and he was coming after me again. I said, tell me more about him having physically abused you. I don't remember this because he never did that to me. She wrote back and she said, it wasn't bad in my opinion. At first he would just grab my arm really hard when I wouldn't listen to him, until one day he asked me to dial the phone so he could speak to Mother. I told him he was a grown man and could call her for himself. I was laying in bed. He came into my room and started choking me for a few seconds. I guess he realized what he was doing and he stopped, walked away, and acted like nothing happened. So the week that I came back from Girl Scout camp before Mother, and interject here, my sister and mother were heavily involved in Girl Scouts for a few years, and that was a refuge for both of them. And this could have been when I was off in college. No, it wasn't. Well, they were doing that when I was off in college, but this happened before when I was home. So the weekend I came back from Girl Scout camp before Mother, so it just would have been her and my dad in the house, I went to eat my ice cream. He was sitting in the den, my ice cream was gone, and when I confronted him about eating it, that's when he started to charge at me because I called him a liar. He was the only one home. Who else would have eaten it? Anyway, since I was in the kitchen, that's when I grabbed the knife. Somehow he got past me and was in the living room at this point. I was between him and the kitchen bedrooms. He told me to stab him so he could call the cops and throw me in jail. I told him I would only stab him if it was in self-defense and for him to leave me alone. That's when I was able to go to my bedroom and pack a bag and leave. That's all she wrote. My mother has since told both of us that was the straw that broke the camel's back. That was the point that she said, okay, I'm done, I'm leaving, and I'm getting my girls out of this. She said that she left then because she didn't want my sister to ruin her life because of our father. So my mom got an attorney. She filed for divorce. He signed the papers. They got divorced. In Texas, it's, like I said, what I think they call a no-fault state. When you get divorced, the law is that the husband and wife split everything 50-50. Somehow my mom was able to get him to agree to something different. She said since it was her and my sister and me, that she should get 3/4 and he should get 1/4. because I doubt he would have let her got away with him getting nothing. So they ended up with, because they sold the house, they ended up getting $40,000 from the divorce. So she got $30,000, he got $10,000. My father took his $10,000, he put it into a bank account, and he put my name on it with him and told me that I was free, welcome, to access that account and take whatever I needed to pay for whatever I needed. And I thought that was really nice. But I also, even, despite everything we'd been through, I was a good person, and I thought, well, that money's not mine, so I'm not going to touch it, even though he's stolen all this stuff from me. That's his money, not mine. I'm not going to spend it. I have a part-time job. I'll use my own money for whatever I want. About a month later, I started getting notices from the bank that the account was overdrawn. He spent $10,000 in 1 month. And it more than that, actually, because it was overdrawn by about $300. So it turned out he was, when I went back and looked at the bank statements, he was withdrawing about $300 a day from ATMs, which was the limit, so he got as much as he could every day. Had nothing at all to show for it, so we all know where that money was going, right up his nose. And I had to pay, because my name was on the account too, I had to pay $300 to close the account out. I also had a 1963 Ford Fairlane. My parents bought me that car. It was my first car, and they got it pretty cheap, like $2,000 or something, from a guy in the newspaper. And it was a gorgeous car. And I won't talk about that now. If you want to know more about that car, ask and I'll make another video or something about it. But it had started to fall apart, and back then it was before the internet made it easy to find parts, so it was very difficult to find parts to fix the car. So I ended up buying a new car with the job that I had. I was able to purchase a brand new car, make payments and stuff. So I sold my Fairlane to my father, and I forget, he gave me $1,000 or something for it. And within a few weeks or a month or whatever it was, I got a call from him that he'd wrecked the car. And it turned out that he wrapped the car around a telephone pole. I'm sure he was high. He said that he fell asleep at the wheel or something. It happened in a very seedy neighborhood. And I went with him to the junkyard where it was and saw the poor thing and nearly started crying because I loved that car so much. Even though I'd sold it to him, I still really loved the car, and it hurt me to see it so broken because there was no fixing it. It was totaled. So he spent $10,000 a month and wrecked a 1963 Ford Fairlane. And if you are familiar with classic cars, those things are tanks. So he had to have been going pretty fast to slam into that telephone pole enough. It was this big dent in the car, like in the front of the car, not in the side or anything, but in the front where you have to, you hit the engine and all that stuff. It was ridiculous. So that happened. During this time, he was living with friends because he couldn't live on the home property anymore because that had been sold. So he was living with friends, right? He lived with friends for, it seems like maybe a year or so. It was more like months, but it was a while that he was able to move around with different friends. And then finally he became truly homeless, where he was living in a park in a cardboard box behind some building. And he did that for a few months, and same sort of thing as with prison. I would go visit him there sometimes just out of curiosity to see what this lifestyle was like, because it was so far beyond normal, And I knew I could go visit him because I was safe. He'd, again, never done anything physical to me, and I knew he wouldn't. So anyway, it was interesting to see how somebody lived in a cardboard box and how you make that work. At some point after that, he got himself involved with a tire shop in Houston that was on the corner at a major intersection. It's one of the freeways. I'm not going to say the names of the streets, but it's one of the freeways that goes right through Houston, and then another really major street. There was a tire shop there, and he got in with them somehow, and they had this little trailer, like a 6x8 trailer maybe, or 6x10 trailer, like the kind you rent at U-Haul. And they used that for tire storage. Somehow he got himself in a situation where they let him live in that trailer, so at least he had shelter. And there was no like running water or electricity or anything. I think he had a power cord running out there, so he had a fan at least, circulating fan. But he lived there for quite a while. I think it was a few years. And I'd visit him there sometimes and talk to him and see how things are going. And on Thanksgiving, after we'd have the big family Thanksgiving, we'd take him a plate of food. And during this time, he also, I think he did a little work at the tire shop, but he also stood on the street corner. And as far as I know, he still does this. He stood on the street corner at this major intersection, and he held a sign. And his sign said that he was in a house fire and his wife was injured and he needed money because of that. So because of this experience with him and hearing the stories that he's told me of other homeless people that he knows and the signs that they have and the situations that they come from and the kinds of things that they still do, I am not a person who gives money to people on the street corner because I don't want to support things like my father, like actions. I'm not calling a person a thing, but the actions that some of these people do. So just be aware if you are somebody who gives like that to people on the corner or on the subway or whatever, that, you might be supporting that. And it's, in my opinion, it's better if you want to give to less fortunate people or homeless people to give to a reputable shelter organization or a food bank or something. And he would go to the food banks too. I went with him to one at a church one time, and he got a paper bag full of groceries, and he would complain to me about it because on one hand it sounds ungrateful, but on the other it's kind of understandable. He'd complain because it was always the same sort of thing, like green beans and rice and a can of beans or something, and he got sick of that. But yeah, it's better than nothing, right? So at this point, as far as I know, like I said, I haven't talked to him in a few years, but the last I heard, he was living in this house near that tire shop, and I visited the house a couple of times, and I'll tell you about the last time I was there. But it's this 2-story house, old house, that's very run down, like falling apart, like kind of in the shape that our house was by the time we left. And it has rooms built onto it. It's very ramshackle. And then people live in different rooms and they have communal kitchen area. It's really filthy and disgusting and terrible. And it can't be legal. It can't be. But I saw that again out of curiosity about where he was and how people like him live. My mother, on the other hand, after the divorce, was able to purchase a brand new house. When we first saw it, it wasn't even finished yet. And it's a very small house. She still lives there in a neighborhood far out in the suburbs of Houston, but brand new. She'd never had anything brand new. She was able to buy brand new furniture. And let me show you something real quick. Come here. Come here. So she was able to buy brand new furniture. And this guy right here, when he was a puppy, he ate the arm of her brand new couch. That's me. I did it. He was very bad. He got in big trouble. but he survived, and he's okay, and he doesn't chew things anymore. He's very good. He's 13 now. His name is Sebastian. Let's see. So she bought the new house. I moved in with her. My sister moved in with her while we were still in school. I finished up school in Houston, and then I moved in 2005 back to New York to go to grad school. At one point when I was up in grad school, my mom came to visit me because I was presenting my master's thesis, and it was a big deal. And so she came to visit me, and while she was there, I got a voicemail or a phone call from my father, and he said that he was standing at the fence at my mother's house petting her dog. And we had very consciously not told him where she lived, so I'm not sure how he found out. I guess it's kind of easy to find where people live these days. But yeah, he knew that she was out of town. He knew that she was up in New York visiting me. So he called just to let us know that he was at her house petting her dog. So at some point, I want to say it was after they got divorced, but I'm not certain of that. My mother told me, and then I asked my father about it. He told me about his past as a drug dealer. And this was before I was born. All the stuff I'm going to tell you now, and I don't know a whole lot, but it was before I was born. He and a cousin of his from Michigan were drug dealers. They got drugs from Mexico, and this was all pot. It wasn't anything heavier as far as I've heard. So they got drugs from Mexico, which makes them international dealers, right? And they had this scheme where they got them into Houston and transported them up to Michigan. So they're doing interstate trafficking and international trafficking of drugs. The bedroom that I grew up in, which was, let's say it's about 10 by 10 feet and normal height ceilings, whatever that is, 7 feet, 8 feet. I've been told that that room was packed to the ceiling many times over with pot. Like, that's how heavy into it he was. That cousin at one point was dropped in a ditch by people and left to, die, find his way home, I don't know. They knew somebody who got killed in this trade. So it started to make a little more sense, I guess, how all this stuff happened in our life, because it made sense that it wasn't so sudden that he started doing cocaine, that this was a pattern throughout his life. And then when he was in high school, he was in prison because, he dropped out of high school. He never graduated, but he got his GED in prison. But it wasn't drug-related, that one. He'd written hot checks. Like, he wrote checks from, not his account, but checks from somebody else's account. So he had theft in his past, too. When I finally broke ties with him, because for years I was the only one of the three of us, of my mom and my sister, who was still communicating with him. The reason I finally broke ties is because he went off to prison for 6 months or a year or something. And when he got arrested, I think he called me to let me know. And I don't know if he was even letting me know. He wanted me to let his landlord at that awful house know about it, that he was going to be gone. And he wanted me to go get some things from him, from his room. And I went, again, out of curiosity, and because I had some questions, I went to visit him in jail before he was sent off to prison. And boy, that experience was not good for me. That they herded you like cattle, the visitors, and they treated you like criminals. That was not pleasant. I didn't understand. They were much nicer at prison. I didn't understand. Okay, I'm getting this message again. Apparently I can't do videos that are more than, this one's 45 minutes. Good Lord, I'm talking a long time about all this. So I don't have a whole lot more to say, but I'm going to go ahead and stop this and do part 3, I guess. in another video. So I will be back. Well, click on my next video and you'll see the rest. I promise it won't be as long as the last two. All right, I'm stopping it.